Hello and welcome to Wild West Faces. The following story tells about the time when General Nelson Miles and his regiment were running very low on supplies. So 6 men volunteered to try to get to the closest fort and bring supplies back. 2 scouts and 4 soldiers. Of course, they had quite a distance to cover, and as you can imagine, they ran into a large band of Kiowa and Comanche warriors. Well, these Native Americans were pretty intent on not letting them reach their destination. Listen to this amazing story of their fight, called the Buffalo Wallow Fight of 1874.
The most perilous adventure of my life occurred September 12th of 1874 in what was known as the Buffalo Wallow Fight. My escape from death was nothing short of miraculous. The year 1874, as the reader or listener doubtless may have observed, brought me full measure of things I had dreamed of doing when a boy. I came in contact with hostile Indians pretty much as frequently as the most devoted warrior might have ever wished, and I found that it was serious business. General Nelson A. Miles, who was in command of the troops campaigning against the Indians in the Southwest, he was on McClellan Creek in the Panhandle when he ordered Amos Chapman and myself, scouts, and 4 enlisted men to carry dispatches to Fort Supply. When General Miles handed us the dispatches, he told us we could have all the soldiers we thought necessary. His command was short of rations. We preferred, however, the smallest possible number. Leaving camp, we traveled mostly at night, resting in secluded places during the day. War parties were moving in every direction, and there was danger of attack at every turn. On the second day, just as the sun was rising, we were nearing a divide between the Washita River and Gageby Creek. Riding to the top of a little knoll, we found ourselves almost face to face with a large band of Kiowa and Comanche warriors. Well, the Indians saw us at the same instant, and circling, quickly surrounded us. We dismounted and placed our horses in the care of George Smith, but in a moment or two, poor Smith was shot down, and the horses stampeded. Now, when Smith was shot, he fell flat on his stomach, and his gun fell from his hand far beyond his reach. But no Indian was ever able to capture that gun, because if one ventured near Smith, we never failed to bring him down. We thought Smith was dead when he fell, but he survived until about 11 o'clock that night. We saw that there was no possibility for us to survive on this little hillside, and decided that our best fighting ground was a small mesquite flat several hundred yards distant. Before we undertook to shift our position, though, a bullet struck Amos Chapman. I was looking at him when he was shot. Amos said, "Billy, I'm hit at last," and eased himself down. The fight was so hot that I did not have time to ask him how badly he was hurt. Every man, save Rath and myself, had been wounded. Our situation was growing more desperate every minute. I knew that something had to be done, and quickly, or else all of us in a short while would be dead or in the hands of the Indians, who probably would torture us in the most inhumane manner before taking our lives. I could see where the buffaloes had pawed and wallowed a depression, commonly called a buffalo wallow, and I ran for it at top speed. Well, it seemed as if a bullet whizzed past me at every jump, but somehow I got through unharmed. The wallow was about 10 feet in diameter. I found that its depth, though slight, afforded some protection. I shouted to my comrades to try to come to me, which all of them, save Smith and Chapman, commenced trying to do. As each man reached the wallow, he drew his butcher knife and began digging desperately with knife and hands to throw up the dirt around the sides. The land happened to be sandy, and we made good headway, though constantly interrupted by the necessity of firing at the Indians as they dashed within range. It was probably about noon before we reached the wallow. Many times that terrible day did I think that my last moment was at hand. After all had reached the wallow, with the exception of Chapman and Smith, with all of us thinking that Smith was dead, somebody called to Chapman to come on in. We now learned for the first time that Chapman's leg was broken. He called back that he could not walk, as his left knee was shattered. I made several efforts to reach him before I succeeded. Every time the Indians saw me start, they would fire such a volley that I was forced to retreat, until finally I made a run of it and got to Chapman. I told him to climb on my back, my plan being to carry him as I would a little child. I drew both his legs in front of me, and laying the broken one over the sound one to support it, I carried him to the wallow, though not without difficulty, as he was a much larger man than myself, and his body was dead weight. It taxed my strength to carry him. We were now all in the wallow except Smith, and we felt that it would be foolish and useless to risk our lives in attempting to bring in his dead body. We had not seen him move since the moment he went down. We began digging like gophers with our hands and knives to make our little wall of earth higher, and shortly had heaped up quite a little wall of dirt around us. Its protection was quickly felt, even though our danger was hardly lessened. Sometimes the Indians would ride toward us at headlong speed with lances uplifted and poised, undoubtedly bent upon spearing us. Such moments made a human brace himself and grip his gun. Fortunately, we were able to keep our heads and to bring down or disable the leader. Such charges proved highly dangerous to the Indians and gradually grew less frequent. Thus, all that long, hot September day, the Indians circled around us or dashed past, yelling and cutting all kinds of capers. All morning we had been without water, and the wounded were sorely in need of it. In the stress and excitement of such an encounter, even a man who has not been hurt grows painfully thirsty, and his tongue and lips are soon as dry as a whetstone. Ours was the courage of despair. We knew what would befall us if we should be captured alive. We had seen far too many naked and mangled bodies of white men who had been spread-eagled and tortured with steel and fire to forget what our own fate would be. So we were determined to fight to the end, not unmindful of the fact that every once in a while there was another dead or wounded Indian. About 3 o'clock, a black cloud came up in the west, and in a short time the sky shook and blazed with thunder and lightning. Rain fell in blinding sheets, drenching us to the skin. Water gathered quickly in this Buffalo Wallow, and our wounded men eagerly bent forward and drank from the muddy pool. It was more than muddy. That water was red with their own blood that had flowed from their wounds and lay clotting and dry in the hot September sun. The storm and the rain proved our salvation, however. The wind had shifted to the north and was now drearily chilling us to the bone. An Indian dislikes rain, especially a cold rain, and these Kiowas and Comanches were no exception to the rule. We could see them in groups out of rifle range, sitting on their horses with their blankets drawn tightly around them. The plains country beats the world for quick changes in weather, and in less than an hour after the rain had fallen, the wind was bitterly cold. Not a man in our crowd had a coat, and our thin shirts were scant protection. Our coats were tied behind our saddles when our horses stampeded and were lost beyond recovery. I was heart-sick over the loss of my coat, for in the inside pocket was my dearest treasure, my mother's picture, which my father had given me shortly before his death, and I was never able to recover it. Necessity compelled us to save every cartridge as long as possible and not to fire at an Indian unless we could see that he meant business and was coming right into us. Late in the afternoon, somebody suggested that we go out and get Smith's belt and six-shooter, as he had been shot early in the fight, and his belt undoubtedly was loaded with cartridges. Rath offered to go, and soon returned and said that Smith was still alive, which astonished us greatly, as well as causing us to regret that we had not known it earlier in the day. Rath and I at once got ready to bring Smith to the Buffalo Wallow. By supporting the poor wounded fellow between us, he managed to walk. We could see that there was no chance for him. He was shot through the left lung, and when he breathed, the wind sobbed out of his back under the shoulder blade. Near the wallow, an Indian had dropped a stout willow switch with which he had been whipping his pony. With his switch, a silk handkerchief was stuffed into the gaping bullet hole in Smith's back. Night was approaching, and it looked blacker to me than any night I've ever seen. Ours was a forlorn and disheartening situation. The Indians were still all around us. The nearest relief was 75 miles away. Of the 6 men in the wallow, 4 were badly wounded and without anything to relieve their suffering. We were cold and hungry, nothing to eat, and without a blanket, coat, or hat to protect us from the rain and the biting wind. It was impossible to rest or sleep in the 2 inches of water in Wallow. Smith had grown much worse and was begging us in piteous tones to shoot him and put an end to his terrible sufferings. We found it necessary to watch him closely. There was not a man among us who had not thought about that same melancholy fate. When the fight was at its worst, with the Indians closing in on all sides, and when it seemed that every minute would be our last, I was strongly tempted to take my butcher knife, which I kept at razor edge, and cut off my hair. In those days, my hair was black and heavy and brushed my shoulders. As a matter of fact, I was rather proud of my hair. Its luxuriance would have tempted any Indian to scalp me at the first opportunity. I had a further and final plan to save my last bullet for self-destruction. Poor Smith endured his agony like a brave soldier, though. Our hearts ached, but we could do nothing to relieve his pain. About 10 o'clock that night, he fell asleep, and we were glad of it, for in sleep he could forget his sufferings. Later in the night, one of the boys felled of him to see how he was getting along. He was cold in death. Men commonly think of death as something to be shunned. There are times, however, when its hand falls as tenderly as the touch of a mother's hand, and when its coming is welcomed by those to whom hopeless suffering has brought the last bitter dregs of life. We lifted the body of our dead comrade and gently laid it outside the buffalo wallow on the mesquite grass, covering the white face with a silk handkerchief. Then the rest of us huddled together on the damp ground and thought of the morrow. That night is indelibly stamped in my memory, many a time having its perils filled my dreams, until I awoke startled and thrilled by a feeling of imminent danger. Every night the same stars are shining way out there in the panhandle. The winds sigh as mournfully as they did then, and I often wonder if a single settler who passes the lonely spot knows how desperately 6 men once battled for their lives where now may be plowed fields and safety and the comforts of civilization. Billy Dixon.